What should have been a game that could not necessarily be better than the Grand Theft Auto titles at the time, but at least be up there as a solid alternative to the open world genre riding on the success of the PS1. Instead, Driver 3 represented everything that was wrong with Atari SA in the 2000s. They released the game knowing it was unfinished, and in a desperate attempt to ensure a successful launch, Atari fixed review scores on magazines owned by Future, silencing any complaints from players, and after they were exposed, they attempted to completely sweep everything under the rug like nothing happened. But we're still talking about it today, so maybe not completely. They call it Drivergate. But what could have easily killed a gaming franchise prematurely, despite the scandals and backlash, Atari announced a new Driver game less than a year later. In Reflections, without Martin Edmondson, basically wanted to start from scratch, fix all the major issues from Driver 3, almost pretend they never made it, review as much of the feedback that wasn't erased by Atari, and put the focus back into the driving, sticking to the philosophy how to get players in cars, driving fast through traffic and smashing things up. Driver Parallel Lines was released for the PlayStation 2 and Xbox on March 2006, and the PC and Nintendo Wii a year later, and this was the point where the Driver series completely slipped my mind. Even though I finally got a PlayStation 2 that same year, I was glued to the GTA series, at least with every opportunity I had when my parents weren't watching. And the only reason I've reviewed the Driver games up to this point is because of my supporters on Patreon who keep voting the Driver series in the game suggestion thread. Seriously, Stuntman Driver 2, 3, and Parallel Lines, all developed by Reflections, keep leading those suggestion threads. It's only inevitable that San Francisco follows suit. Just note guys, if a Just Dance title co-developed by Reflections gets the most votes next, I'm not reviewing it. Otherwise, thanks IndieDM for suggesting this game. I got the Steelbook case that includes the soundtrack on a bonus CD. A good soundtrack I might add. And I got this when I was on holidays at the Gold Coast. Don't forget to check out that video after watching this one, along with a few others that are also destined to be highly voted suggestions on Patreon. So did Reflections, or Atari more so, learn their lessons after the Drivergate scandal?
So what had I done to deserve so much fun? Why was I the guy with all the luck? I'll tell you why. I was a wheelman, and I was the best. Get what you came for? Fucking move, kid!
Set in 1978, Terry Kidhams, or The Kid, or TK, a young getaway driver who isn't undercover, completes multiple jobs across New York City, impressing all the members of a gang led by Detective Corrigan, a corrupt member of the police force looking to dominate the drug trade in the city. Where's Tanner when you need him? They all get together to kidnap rival boss Rafael Martinez in exchange for ransom money, with TK doing most of the work. However, after the ransom money is collected,
cops are gonna need somebody in the frame. You're it.
Me?
TK is double-crossed, framed, and sentenced to prison for 28 years. Fast forward to 2006, he's released and reunites with Ray and Maria to avenge every single one of those members that betrayed him, one by one.
One chance.
When?
Just get here. I'll be ready.
In some ways, this is the edgiest of the Driver series, probably thanks to the heavy reliance of the F word and the more explicit criminal operations, whereas previous Driver titles were about stolen cars and assassinations. But at the same time, based on the way the characters move around and the vibrant presentation, it's the most cartoony and over the top of the series. Well, when I say over the top, I mean by design, not unintentionally. It still uses full motion video for the cutscenes, which I would say slightly ages it better, but the character animations in-game are very inconsistent with each other, and that's being kind.
I just fixed you up with a shot at the big time.
Thanks, but no thanks.
So keep working nickel and dime stores.
I don't need your help, Ray.
And TK is too generic without any connection. The only thing that stands out is how the 2006 version of him looks like Roger Waters. And everybody else, there's just nothing to them. Genuinely, this was the hardest part of the review to write because I had nothing to say.
Been a while, huh? You get them cookies I sent?
Been 28 years, and no, I don't recall any cookies.
In a way, being in the 70s is a representation of how chill things were in TK's life, with crime in New York being sky high back then. I do like the 70s style motion effects and transitions used in the cutscenes. But then when time advances to 2006, the main selling point of this game, that's when I started paying more attention to what was going on, with TK being all business, with revenge being the only thing on his mind. That long prison sentence seems like the only way to make the drastic timeline shifts plausible, but it is a very good idea. There have been plenty of open world games that have done it before and after, including Mafia or Red Dead Redemption, where characters are much older and serve as a fitting epilogue for the story. But 1970s to the 2000s is such a drastic shift in eras, especially in New York.
Hey Ray, it's cool. You know, it's history.
And when the story advances times, all the vehicles are modern, radio stations, the HUD and menus are updated, and buildings which were under construction are complete with more glass. These changes are mostly cosmetic, and as I just mentioned, nor are there any real character changes in TK after being in prison for 28 years. But playing Driver Parallel Lines makes me realize there's a lot of potential for an open world game to have more than one timeline for the same map, and I mean very different from the other. You can have multiple map and road changes, and even a change in gameplay as the main protagonist is older, which would work as a difficulty curve increase. Also, in previous Driver titles, while it took clear inspiration from car chase thrillers including Bullets, Vanishing Points and The French Connection, the year it was set was left ambiguous. Almost like the James Bond movie series set in whatever year a certain movie was made. Parallel Lines gets straight to the point. It's set in the 70s and the second half is set in what was the present at the time.
Drop me in Harlem. You gonna be able to lose him?
Relax, man. Enjoy the ride.
My immediate first impression of this game is Driver 3 if it was actually finished, with all the trademark driving mechanics recycled from all their titles from the 6th generation. And also driving through the Big Apple to start the game, True Crime New York City. Even though it's not a 100% recreation of New York, it does a surprisingly solid job giving you the illusion of how large New York is in general, with endless, very tall buildings and a long draw distance, particularly when driving over bridges and through Central Park, with a lot of the city's notable landmarks present, though at times it comes at the cost of performance. Like, look at the state of that. It doesn't happen too often, fortunately. Even the alleyways, despite recycling the same props every time you went through one, they look a lot more detailed than the ones in GTA. Now that I think about it, they're more detailed than anything outside the alleyways. And sticking with graphics, it's also one of the rare games on the PlayStation 2 that has a 480p option in the PAL region. And despite being the only map in the whole game, there's more drivable road here than all the maps from Driver 3 combined. The more games I play that are set or based off New York City, the more I want to go there. Maybe I should go to some of the most notable landmarks in that area and compare them to other video games that are set there in the future. Why didn't they just call this game Driver New York?
You know what happened to the kid who asked too many questions?
No.
Crisis. Another great night at the Yankee Stadium. Will they...
Instead of a linear story structure that sets itself on separate maps and goes straight to the next one, Driver Parallel Lines resembles more closely to a GTA clone where mission markers are scattered all over New York, with other things to do including street races and small crimes that earn you money, also new to a Driver game, although it's only really used for vehicle customization, also a series first even if it's only mandatory for one mission.
This is where the magic happens.
It's not exactly Need for Speed Underground levels of diverse. Performance seems to be a larger priority, but neither was GTA San Andreas. At least the money is used for driving-based purposes, and I do appreciate that after all the money you might spend on customization options, vehicles can be saved in these garages, so if you end up destroying one of them, you can come back and it'll be there like nothing happened.
Yeah, you got the golden touch, kid. These wheels are looking fly.
Unfortunately, these side missions are the only way to make money. You don't earn anything in the story missions. While it's a good way to encourage the player to do them, they're just as boring as most of the ones in GTA, and vehicle customization and weapons are all you do with your money. But the worst thing about this game, because of the map size, the distance to any of the markers of interest are way too long, almost as if, like the other games, going from point A to B is a mission in itself. Now, okay, sometimes I get a small kick out of swerving through that heavy traffic during missions in a time limit without taking damage, and that rocket-powered bike is awesome. Vehicles control very similarly to the other games. It has that distinctive Reflections trademark where cars weave and bounce around depending on how much you accelerate or how quickly you go around a corner. They're certainly a lot easier to drive, less likely to slide out. The lampposts, the sort of map obstacles that stop you instantly in previous titles, can be run over, though hit detection can be questionable. It feels like the driving mechanics don't differ that much between other vehicles apart from top speed. Like, look at that hatchback, bulldoze that van. But inevitably, the map size becomes more of a hindrance than anything else since you're that far away from anything.
If I live to make 30, this'll be the slowest thing I ever drive.
You can say that again because I'm convinced every car on this map has a speed limiter installed, including the supercars. You think for the distance to get to the locations, it's the last thing that would put on the cars, probably ordered by Detective Corrigan to make it easier for the police to catch you. Like, I don't know what this guy is carrying on about.
Oh, hey, no more.
You can use the garages to teleport yourself to different parts of the map, which are scattered around the outside where the racetracks are. And at some point in the story, a safe house in the middle of Manhattan, but even with those hotspots, it can still take roughly 5 minutes. It's worth noting too that the wanted system works very similarly to the predecessors. Police are driving past randomly, and whenever you drive through a red light, wrong side of the road, or sneeze in their presence, oh, they really hate that. Every one of these egregious crimes are punishable by death. They're really strict is what I'm saying, especially in 2006. That's not a bad mechanic though. Have the heat on the car, not yourself if you aren't seen. So if you lose the heat, which is surprisingly not hard to do, if you get out, the police will simply drive past. But if you perform bad actions on foot, you're stuck with the heat until you either complete or enter a mission.
We've lost the suspect. Case in progress.
Most of the time. Good thing it has an autosave feature. However, imagine that level of police activity on the street and combine it with the long distances needed to reach the mission marker. It's way more tedious than it looks in the footage, and it's honestly better to just drive as fast as possible, since they're clearly not as aggressive as the heat in something like Driver 2. And you can still lose the heat by getting out of the car and gunning them down like Driver 3. Double especially since one weapon has infinite ammo, although because TK isn't an undercover cop this time, at least it isn't out of character.
We've lost the suspect.
As you'd expect, given that John Tanner moved around like he had no knees when controlling him on foot in Driver 3. Seriously, what do you call that? Parallel Lines is objectively better. Kind of a shame because as clunky as it was to control, I did get a kick out of making fun of it. This just feels generic if you put it next to a third-person shooter. You can say that about the GTA titles in hindsight. I don't think they're talked about as much control-wise because so many people have played these games they'll know where the enemy placements are when replaying them. The annoying thing on foot is how enemies don't react to being shot and they continue to shoot at you, therefore it's virtually impossible to not take damage during shootouts. That might explain why there are so many first aid kits laying around to compensate.
That's the second hit. Somebody's on to me.
And you still find yourself developing unorthodox techniques to complete missions. For example, the easiest way to lose an enemy tail is to exit the car and take them all out on foot. And okay, I wasn't recording when this happened because this mission took a lot of attempts to complete, but when it came down to taking down one of the main bad guys TK is going after, I was strafing around in circles with the enemy locked on the whole time, waiting for him to die because his health bar was so large. Basically spamming the R1 button to the point that I was concerned about what this would do to the controller long term, especially given that I'm using a real PS2 DualShock to play this. They're hard to find in good condition nowadays. Even further magnified whenever you need to take out enemy vehicles. Reminds me more of Scarface The World Is Yours, where you have more control over who to shoot at while in the vehicle. Less like a gun being attached to a vehicle in Driver 3, apart from not being able to shoot from behind, and there are countless moments where you want to so badly.
Bam! Better keep your ears open. I'm gonna be calling your ass when some work comes in.
If there's one thing Parallel Lines differs from its predecessors is how it holds your hand with endless tutorials interrupting the gameplay seemingly every half minute. Some might argue that it takes away one of the franchise's traits of putting you undercover and you're expected to know how everything works from the start. Control, map, story. And as much as I hate that parking lot, which seems like a distant memory by this point, I actually agree, or at least it holds your hand a little too tightly. After my experience with the first 3 Driver games, which had some of the most out of whack difficulty curve than any other franchise. Okay, Driver 3 wasn't too bad actually, and the parts that were hard mostly came down to skill rather than luck, at least when you weren't defending from behind. Those were the worst. In Parallel Lines, the first 60% of the playthrough, whenever I failed a mission, it was only once or twice, and checkpoints are placed in reasonable spots. For example, to those who have played this game, this mission where you drive through the industrial part of the map and a demolished building, collecting money from a helicopter and ride all the way back to the start while avoiding the heat. If this was a PS1 driver title, you'd have to complete the whole mission in one go. And additionally, if you restart from the checkpoint, it fully replenishes your health. It's only when TK is taking out one of the men that betrayed him does it become really hard. Probably because each one involves pressing the R1 button so much, and how I hate the thought of going through it again if I fail.
Come on, man! Seen a new side to you, Ray. It's the old side, man. Before, you know. Yeehaw! Oh, yeah!
I also sort of like the level designs for the missions, in which you're driving around construction areas, around the buildings. When I was a kid, I found that sort of level design fascinating, like finding another part of the map that can only be discovered through story mode. I was able to recognize some parts of the map after completing this game, so at least it makes an admirable effort to use up as much of this huge map as possible.
Aw, man, why is it always the last place you look?
That said, there are so many stretches where missions feel undercooked. This one, for example, you need to make sure the driver the Mexican put a bet on wins the race. And while it's fun to ram into the opponent so blatantly, no race fixing to see here.
Take care of the other drivers, kid!
You have to wait for the opponents to come past, and if you total the car, you have a spare one in the pits. It's a lot more tedious than it sounds getting to one. And if you smash all the opponents, you have to wait for the clear winner to finish the race, so you could be sitting there for a few minutes doing literally nothing. It's a structure that really doesn't have one. When you're on the racetrack, it doesn't really feel like a racing game, which, given Reflections' history with the genre, that's disappointing. And while the map feels more alive than Driver 3, with pedestrians having their own unique dialogue and doing more than walking in a straight line, it feels too empty to justify its size. You're driving a long distance even for a side mission, avoiding the heat at least half a dozen times in the process, and it gets boring fast. Seriously, that's what kills this game.
You should work with professionals.
Yeah, thanks, kid. That's real helpful now. They were supposed to be professionals!
Well, you're welcome anyhow.
What?
I knew going into this game that the GTA series was clearly better, but I wanted to figure out precisely why. Because on the surface, you perform criminal-based activities scattered on a large sandbox map, and you have the option to ignore them and free roam and take on the entire NYPD. So why do we like the GTA titles more? Well, there's a lot more variety on the map, more to interact with, endless pop culture references of some of our favorite movies and TV shows, and the characters you played and interacted with are some of the most memorable in any video game ever. It's just cooler. If you're gonna copy the GTA series and distance yourself from the backlash of Driver 3, you better expect comparisons, since they were and still are the template of the open world genre. It feels like Reflections gave up and copied even more from their rivals to make sure they didn't screw up as badly. I mean, from a functionality perspective, Driver Parallel Lines is objectively better than Driver 3. Graphically, it's more pleasant to look at, it does a good job giving you that illusion you're in the middle of New York, and despite my issues with the controls, some of the level designs purpose made for the missions, they can get quite intense.
Yeehaw!
But I will say this, if Driver 3 was finished and it had the on-foot mechanics cleaned up to work competently, I would actually rate that game over this. It's not downright terrible or anything like that, the drastic timeline change is a good idea that I doubt we'll see in any future open world title. At least nothing that drastic, since game publishers will just release it as a sequel for more money, right? But there's no sense of ambition or even any relation to the Driver series. No John Tanner, no driving challenges, not even a director mode, which could have been used in multiple ways for stunt bonuses, take your own replays and snapshots. And even back then, there were other open world games that weren't called Grand Theft Auto that are far superior offerings. It was honestly just as frustrating to write the script for this review than it was to beat any of the previous Driver titles, because that's how much of a nothing game Parallel Lines is. If there's one thing I've learned about making this video as a game reviewer, average is actually worse than bad. And if Parallel Lines wasn't the most voted Patreon request, I honestly wouldn't have bothered playing it. I probably should have gone straight to Driver San Francisco. Between the PS2 and Xbox releases for Driver Parallel Lines and the Wii version, Reflections Interactive were bought out by Ubisoft, and Martin Edmondson, who left Reflections in the game industry for a few years, returned to direct the said follow-up, starring John Tanner and stopping Charles Jericho without any on-foot gameplay. Just like all times. It's only a matter of time and we'll all know what I'll think about this one. Thank you everyone supporting ColourShed on Patreon, including Alfredo Asuncion, Bibbs, Brittleback, Cooper Munn, Darcy McIntosh, David Myers, Eric Barboza, Ian Walker, Indy DM, Maid, Mike Camilli, Malik Ball, Saleh Khaled, Sean, Thomas Rosendale, USS, VXL, as well as all of you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, click the notification bell, support on Patreon, follow on Twitch, Twitter and Facebook, and I'll speak to you all soon.